We're live. All right, thank you.
All right, so let me see if I can share my screen now. It's working. Share screen. Share. Yeah, that's good. There we go. I hope that's okay. Indigo, tell me if it's not working. Everyone can see this.
It looks great. Looks great on my end.
So, I thought today I just talk a little bit about free will, what it is, do we really have it? This, I think, is quite a nice one to do with one of these mock classes, because this is a topic I actually discuss in my introduction to philosophy classes here at Tufts. And it's a nice one for getting a sense of how philosophers actually approach philosophical problems. They don't just sort of wander around. They do approach these things in a kind of a systematic way, and that's quite nice to see. It's also quite a nice problem because, well, interesting. Another reason it's nice is that, one of the things that surprises people about philosophy sometimes is that philosophers end up believing things that just seem to go fly in the face of common sense. And you wonder, why on earth do they believe such things? It's not as if they're idiots. Leibniz, for instance, great mathematician and philosopher, writing in the 17th and 18th centuries, Leibniz invented calculus in his spare time. Well, perhaps Newton and Leibniz had a big row over who deserved the credit. But, the general view seems to be that they both deserve credit. And yet, despite clearly being a smart guy, he held all sorts of weird beliefs. He held that, for instance, a screen like this, or a table or a chair, consists of infinitesimally small minds, which is a pretty odd thing to believe. So, it's why on earth do philosophers believe such odd, common sense defying things? And I think having a look at this problem gives you a sense of why that is sometimes. And just as a quick preview, perhaps the reason is that common sense is just incoherent. We can't believe all the elements of common sense because they don't fit together. It's internally contradictory. Better to believe something odd than something impossible. All right, so much by way of introduction. So here we go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce 4 principles. So 4 sentences here, each of which seems to be true, perhaps obviously true, perhaps part of common sense, and yet at the end I'll prove that they're incompatible. That's to say, it's just impossible that they all be true. So the puzzle is, which one's the false one. Okay, so off we go. So I'll do these 4 principles in turn. I'll state them and then I'll kind of justify them and I'll try to persuade you that they're true, and then we'll see that they can't all be true. First principle then, every event has a cause. So notice what it doesn't say. The principle doesn't say every event has a known cause. Obviously that's false. There are lots of things that happen and we just don't yet know why they happen. So it just says they have a cause whether we know it or not. It doesn't say that every event has even a knowable cause. Perhaps some causes are just so complicated that we puny, finite human beings could never really grasp the cause entirely. It's just beyond our cognitive capacities. Still, every event has a cause, even if some of the causes are unknowable to us. And it doesn't say every event has an effect. Perhaps that's true too, but it'll turn out not to be relevant to our particular puzzle. So maybe it's true, but it's not really relevant. All right, so there's the principle. Every event has a cause. Why believe it? What's the rationale for it? Well, the basic rationale that people usually give to this principle is this. To reject it is tantamount to accepting magic. So to hold that there are events that are simply uncaused is in effect to believe in magic. You can't observe or prove that every event has a cause. That would require observing every event in the entire universe, past, present, and future, and observing what its causes are, and observing that the latter is the cause of the former, which can't be done. So we can't observe it or prove it, but we do seem to presuppose it and assume it's true. It's presupposed, to be more precise, by us in our everyday lives. Suppose that there's if you've got an old car like me, occasionally there's like a banging noise that comes out of the engine. And suppose you take your car to the mechanic and say, well, what's the cause of the banging? And you come back a few days later and the mechanic says to you, I've had a look at your car and the banging is uncaused. You say, oh, you can't find the cause? No, it's not that I can't find it. It's that it's literally uncaused. There's a noise coming out of the engine and it's not caused by anything. It's not caused by one piece of metal banging against another. It's simply uncaused. I think you'd think the person's gone mad. No one would accept that. So we do seem to presuppose that every event has a cause in our everyday lives, even if you don't know what it is. Moreover, it seems that we do presuppose this principle in science, and that's a good reason to believe it. Scientists are well aware that they don't know the causes of all events, but they don't assume that there are uncaused events that spontaneously happen. They presuppose that every event does have a cause and hope that we'll eventually find out what it is. Perhaps more generally, this is a more controversial claim, but perhaps more generally, the principle is presupposed by rational thought. So it's simply irrational to reject that theory. Anyway, there's a rationale for the principle. So I hope you find this quite persuasive. Let me move on to the second. So my plan is this: I'm going to go through the slides, and then at the end there should be 15 minutes or so for discussion, so we can talk about some of the problems there. But let me kind of get through some of the principles at least before. All right, so there's the first principle. Here's the second one. Sometimes people act freely. So notice again what it doesn't say. It doesn't say that everybody always acts freely. Clearly, that's false. Sometimes people, if they're in prison, they're not acting freely. And it doesn't say that everybody acts freely sometimes. Maybe this is true. Maybe all of us sometimes or other freely. But it doesn't rule out the possibility that there are some poor benighted souls who just never get to act. So what it just says that sometimes some people act freely. So why believe this? Well, there are lots of uncontroversial examples. There you are. You're sitting staring at your computer now. You didn't have to. No one banged you on the head, stuck you in a bag, and dragged you and chained you in front of your computer. You acted freely in coming to watch this mock class. Now, you had your reasons, of course, but you weren't literally compelled to do it. So there seem to be lots of this is a commonplace phenomenon. So it seems to be lots of ordinary controversial times. Moreover, it would be a little strange that if we were to have this concept, the concept of acting freely, but it just never applied to anything. It would be odd that we'd have it at all. So the mere fact that we talk about acting freely, we talk about it a lot, we discuss it, we treat it with we treat it as an important feature of human life, seems to suggest in itself that it does apply sometimes, and there are some cases of acting freely. All right, so there's the second principle. Sometimes people act freely. Third principle. So the third principle is an attempt to spell out what's involved in acting freely, at least in part. So it says that when a person acts freely, this must be true. She could have done something else instead. Acting freely means, this is not the only thing it means, but it means at least having some physically possible alternative. If you literally could not have physically done anything other than what you in fact did, then what you in fact did wasn't done freely. So if no one could have ever done anything other than what you in fact did, no one ever acts freely. So this is simply a second way of restating the principle, not a new principle. It's just the same thing. So again, rationale. So the rationale this time is that it's supposed to be what people sometimes call a conceptual truth. That's to say, it's supposed to spell out what's involved in our ordinary pre-theoretic concept of acting freely. When you talk about people who are acting freely or unfreely, this is what you mean, at least, that the person had some alternative or didn't have some. As I say, it's the bare minimum. It's not the whole story about what acting freely involves, but it's supposed to be a kind of a bare minimum, a necessary condition. It should be acceptable to everybody, is the idea. Even if people disagree about what freedom really amounts to, they should agree to this much. This is like the common core of what people think of when they think of acting freely. In particular, if we think of kind of political debates here. So it should be acceptable to a free marketeer. So a free marketeer, extreme free marketeer, is someone who believes that full freedom involves kind of commercial or economic freedom, and that involves being able to offer anything to anybody at any time for any price, something like that. Others disagree. So a socialist perhaps might say, look, true freedom means being able, not just being able to offer things for sale at certain prices, but it means something much richer than that. It must be that the opportunities you have are genuine opportunities for you. You must be in a position to take advantages of them. So perhaps that involves investment in healthcare and schooling and so on. So they regard this as necessary for full freedom, not merely the legal right to do various things, but the real, it must be a genuine possibility for them to be able to do. So these people disagree. They have disagreements about the nature of freedom and what it involves. Nevertheless, both of them would accept this, I think, that whatever else freedom involves, it involves at least having some alternatives. Okay, there's a third principle. And here's the final. This says, if every event has a cause, then no one could have done anything other than what he or she in fact did. Right? So a bit of terminology here. So the word determinism is used for the combination of this principle and the first one. So if you hold that every event has a cause, and you hold this principle that says that if every event has a cause, no one can do anything else, then you're said to be a determinist. And you can see that the combination of these two principles, the principle that says every event has a cause, and this principle, yields the conclusion that everything's fixed, right? No one could have done anything other than what he or she in fact did. Every event has a cause, everything's fixed, and that's why we call a combination of these two views determinist. That's just a bit of terminology. So let me just give you the rationale for this final fourth principle. So again, this is supposed to be a conceptual truth. Our previous principle was supposed to spell out in part what's involved in the notion of acting freely. This principle is supposed to spell out in part what's involved in the notion of being caused. So it's an explication in part of our ordinary concepts. Let me just give a definition here. So what do we mean by a cause? Well, here's a fairly, it's a fairly rough definition. If we were doing this in a class, we'd refine it in various ways, but it's good enough to be going on with. It's a definition of what it is for one thing to cause another. To say one thing causes another, to say X causes Y, is to say two things. First of all, that X happens earlier than Y. Causes precede their effects, right? They happen before their effects. Perhaps you have some fancy view about time travel and backwards causation, but putting aside these extraordinary cases, in all ordinary cases, the cause happens before its effect. So that's the first thing. The second is that causes make their effects happen. So it's not the case that every preceding event is the cause of every succeeding event, right? Not all earlier events are causes of all later events. So we do need a second clause here. And the second clause says that X makes Y happen. So that's the idea, is that a cause brings about or necessitates or produces its effect, something like that. It makes it inevitable. If one thing causes another, it makes it happen. Okay, so given that definition, I think it's again, the principle is fairly plausible. Look, suppose every event has a cause. Then that means, by our definition, that for every event, there's some preceding event that made it happen. Well, if every event has a cause, so did that cause. So there was an earlier cause that made the first cause I was talking about happen. And then that had an earlier cause again. So you can see, you can just generate a chain of events going all the way back, I don't know, to the Big Bang. If every event has a cause, then for every event, there's some preceding event that makes it happen. In other words, in effect, every event was fixed, determined in advance by some later event. In fact, it's probably determined in advance everything by the Big Bang. So there's our fourth principle. So I hope they sound really, I mean, you may well have an idea about which one is false here, or maybe all of them. But for now, I hope you have an idea of why people find them reasonably plausible. They do seem to be quite convincing, right? All right, so here they are. Every event has a cause. Sometimes people act freely. And then these two conceptual principles, one about freedom. If a person acts freely, she could have done something else. In other words, if no one could have done anything else, no one acts freely. And the fourth principle is also a conceptual principle. If every event has a cause, that means, by our definition of cause, that everything is made to happen in advance. Everything is determined in advance. There were no alternatives. All right, so our four principles, so what? Well, here's the problem. These four principles are logically incompatible. It's logically impossible for them all to be true. You can choose any three of these principles. It doesn't matter which ones, choose any three, and you can logically derive the denial of the fourth. So, for instance, suppose we choose the first principle, every event has a cause, and we choose the fourth principle that says, you know, every caused event is made to happen, so there's no one could have done anything else. If every event has a cause, that means no one could have done anything other than what she in fact did. And then we opt for the kind of second version of the third principle. If no one could have done anything other than what he or she in fact did, then no one ever acts freely. Then it simply follows, as a matter of logic, that no one ever acts freely. This is a valid argument. To say it's valid is to say, just by logic alone, the fourth line follows from the first three. The way to see that it follows, I think, is to kind of replace sentences with just letters, and you get the logical pattern or structure of the argument. So let every event has a cause be A. That if every event has a cause, then no one could have done anything else. B. If A, then B. Then for 3, we have if B, then C. And 4, therefore C. So the overall structure of the argument is like this. A, if A, then B. If B, then C, therefore C. And you can hear that that's just perfectly good logic. So we've chosen 3 of the principles, and we've proved that the other one is false as a matter of logic. And you could choose any 3 and prove that the other one is false. So they're incompatible. So the problem is this. Each of the principles seems true. Indeed, each seems just like common sense, right? It's hard to deny any. But they're incompatible. It's indisputable. Logic is unimpeachable. So one of them has to be false. It's impossible that they will be true. The puzzle is simply which one? Which one's the false principle? All right, so let's have a look at this. You know, there are 4 ways you can go here. There are 4 principles. We've got to reject one of them. So there are 4 kind of routes we can take. We can get the first, the second, the third, and the fourth. I thought we don't have time to look at all 4 options. So I thought we'd just look at 2. Let's first of all look at the rejection of the second principle. And then we'll come back and look at the rejection of the first. So to reject the second principle, the principle that says sometimes people act freely, in effect, we're saying, look, free will is an illusion. Really, nobody ever acts freely. It's just not true that sometimes people act freely. It never happened. Never has happened. Never will happen. People who hold this position, people who reject free will, are sometimes called hard determinists. So they're called determinists because they accept the 2 principles that I mentioned earlier. They accept that every event has a cause, and they accept that that means everything's fixed. So they're called determinists for that reason. Everything's determined. Right? They're called hard determinists because they reject free will. There's another view called soft determinism, which accepts free will and rejects the third principle instead. The principle that says free will means being able to do otherwise. They say these soft determinists say everything's fixed, but that's compatible with acting freely. So we won't have time to look at them. Let's look at hard determinism first of all. They reject the free will thesis. So they think that free will is simply an illusion, and they accept the other 3 principles. Okay, so how do we evaluate hard determinism? Well, in philosophy, we typically evaluate theories by simply seeing how well they stand up to attack. So we've got our theory here, hard determinism. It consists of 4 claims. every event has a cause. If every event has a cause, everything's fixed. If you were acting freely, you'd been able to do otherwise. But finally, no one ever acts free. So that's the theory. So let's see how well it stands up to attack. So I thought we'd look at 3 objections. So off we go. Here's the first objection. So sometimes we feel we're acting freely, right? As I say, you came here, you didn't know and dragged you here in chains. You're sitting in front of your computer. And of course, we all feel like this. We all feel that sometimes we're acting freely. Sometimes you might feel you're compelled to do things. But we all feel we're acting freely in the minimal sense that we could have done otherwise, right? So sometimes we feel we're acting freely. Sometimes we feel that we're acting freely. And, each of us is the best judge of his or her or their own situation. You know better than anybody else whether you have a headache or whether you're bored. Other people won't gainsay you if you claim to have a headache or to be bored. So you're the best judge of your own situation. So if you sometimes feel you're acting freely, well, surely sometimes you are. So that's the objection. And if we're acting freely, of course, our utilitarianism is false because it says no way. All right. So I guess you're thinking that's not a very strong argument. So here's a response. First, just because you feel something is true, it doesn't follow that it is. That's obviously the case, alas. Lots of things that you currently believe are false. That's true of all of us. So there are plenty of things you feel are true, and I'm afraid I couldn't tell you which ones they are. You'll discover some of them. You won't discover others, but it certainly doesn't follow that they are actually true. After all, you might feel that you're the most beautiful belle at the ball, but alas, it doesn't follow that you are. Moreover, the hard determinists can say not only does this, it's true, we sometimes feel we're acting freely, but not only does that not show that we're acting freely, we can actually explain why people feel that they are, even though they're not. So here's an explanation you might give. What's not in dispute is that we're ignorant of the causes of many of our actions. So perhaps many of our actions are caused ultimately by events in our brain, electrical, chemical goings on in our brain. Well, even if it's your brain, I bet you don't know what they are. You don't have any particular insight into the electrochemical events in your own brain. So, if that's the causes of our actions, these sort of events in our brains, then we're clearly ignorant of the causes of many of our actions. But even if you don't buy the brain story, you could still make a strong case for saying we're ignorant of the causes of our actions. Sigmund Freud made a career out of arguing that we're ignorant of our own motivations. He thought we even made plans that we're ignorant of. So they're kind of subconscious, we're not aware of them. They're motivating us, they're kind of psychological factors, they're pushing us one way or another. We just are not aware of what they are. So we're ignorant of the causes of our actions, however you construe causes, whether you construe them in terms of chemistry or you construe them in terms of psychology. It's not really disputable that we're ignorant of the causes of many of our actions. Sometimes we know it. Combine that with a natural tendency to conflate ignorance of something with its absence, and you've got a nice explanation of why we feel we're acting freely, even though, according to hard determinists, we never are. We do have this natural tendency to slip from not knowing about something to kind of assuming it's absent. I should have thought of a better example before I started this. But here's an example. Victorians didn't have the internet, they didn't have TVs or anything like this. So they had to play a lot of parlor games. And one game that the Victorians would sometimes play is that somebody would stand against a black background and they put a black bag on their head and it would look like their head had vanished. And people would roar with laughter at such fun. So I'd be grateful you live in an age when we have the internet. But still, you can see the way. So the hard determinists won't accept this objection. They'll say, in general, feeling something is true doesn't show that it is. Moreover, we can explain away the feeling of acting freely. It's the result really just being ignorant of the causes of our actions, combined with this natural tendency to conflate ignorance of causes with their absence. Not unconvinced. Here's another one, another objection to this hard determinism. Sometimes we do exactly what we choose to do. So, for instance, so the idea here is sometimes you choose to do an action, right? And then you do the very action you've chosen. So I just had a sip of tea. So why have I got tea in my cup? Well, I decided I wanted a cup of tea, so I boiled the kettle, made the tea. I decided to make some tea, and I did. I did exactly what I chose to do. Simple example. And of course, these examples are everything. So the idea then is this: sometimes we do exactly what we choose to do. Doing what we choose to do and acting freely are just the same thing. In everyday speech, we use the phrases acting freely, doing what I choose to do interchangeably. They're just synonymous phrases. So if we are doing what we choose to do, sometimes, then sometimes we're acting freely. That's just what doing what you choose to do means. Right, so there's a second. There's an interesting response here. So this, I think, is the standard response from the hard determinists. They'll say, this is a very slippery objection. The word choose or choice or any of its cognates, they can be understood in two different ways. So sometimes when we use the word choice, we mean a decision. I made a choice, right? Or I decided. You mean that there was a decision, and the decision is it's a mental event of some kind. It goes in your head, in your brain, or Now, if that's what the word choice or choose really means here, sometimes we do what we choose to do and we act on our choice. If that's what the word choice or choose means here, then the hard determinist is just going to say, that doesn't show we're acting freely. Yes, sometimes we do exactly what we've decided to do. That's true. But it doesn't follow that we're acting freely because the choice itself, the decision itself, was caused. It was caused by earlier events, perhaps earlier events in your brain or your mind, and perhaps even earlier still, perhaps like the Big Bang, right? So if choice just means decision, then doing what we choose to do doesn't show we're acting freely because the decisions themselves might all be determined. So, for example, the reason I made tea then is because, I don't know, there's some explanation, right? I decided to make tea because I grew up in England, and as you may well know, in England, all babies are bathed in tea from a very early age, so they can't go a day without it. So hard determinists would say, no, even if it's true that we do exactly what we choose to do, that doesn't show we're acting freely because the decisions themselves are all determined. It might mean alternative instead. So the word choice is sometimes used to mean not a decision, not something in your head, but an alternative. I had a choice. And then you're not referring to like a decision, you're referring to a sort of fork in the road, something extra mental, something out there in the external world. I had a choice. I could have taken route A or route B, something like that. I think a hard determinist will say something like this. Oh, if that's what you mean, then perhaps if we really did do, really had alternatives, then perhaps we were acting freely. But now they simply deny that there ever are choices in this sense. So they'll say, yeah, there are choices in the sense of decisions, but they're all fixed. There are no choices in the sense of alternatives. There never are forks in the road. You might think there are because you're just ignorant of what you're going to do. But in fact, it's all been determined long in advance. You just don't know what it is till you do it, right? So the word choice is a very slippery one. Sometimes it means decision, sometimes it means alternative. But either way, the hard determinist is just not going to accept this as an objection. If it means decision, they'll say, sure, decisions happen, but they're determined. They've got nothing to do with acting freely. If it means alternative, they'll say, no, choices never happen in that sense. There never are alternatives. Either way, I don't think they'd be bothered by this objection. Incidentally, I think this is quite a nice objection because, just a kind of a general remark. In philosophy, all we have to go on are, words, right? We've just got, so historians have, they have documents, and archaeologists have little bits of pottery and stuff like this, little shards. Scientists can do experiments. We've just got words. So there's a huge danger in philosophy that you'll be fooled into believing something that you shouldn't believe. You have the wool pulled over your eyes because people use words in slippery ways. So in my classes, I do insist that the students define any potentially slippery terms. So choice being one. So I think the moral is, when you're talking about freedom, avoid the word choice. Okay, here's another objection, a third final objection to hard determinism. Sometimes we're morally responsible for our actions, and moral responsibility requires that we're acting freely. What do we mean by moral responsibility here? Well, if we were doing an ethics class, and we offer ethics classes every semester, they're very popular, we have a more sophisticated definition than this one, but this is sufficient for our purposes here. To say somebody X is morally responsible for a certain action means that the person deserves praise or blame for doing it. So notice, it doesn't mean that you will be praised or blamed. Sometimes you deserve praise and you don't get it, alas. Sometimes you deserve blame and you get away with it. So it doesn't say you are praised or blamed. It means it says you deserve it. To be morally responsible for an action means deserving to be praised or blamed for doing it. And the claim is that clearly we do this. So perhaps you help an old lady across the road, and you deserve praise for that, right? Perhaps you push an old lady under a bus and you deserve blame for it. But either way, that's the idea. It's deserving. That's the key here, the moral responsibility. All right. So we're morally responsible for our actions. We deserve praise and blame for our actions. But that shows we must be acting freely, right? Because you don't deserve blame for something that you couldn't avoid. You don't deserve praise for something you couldn't avoid. If you really weren't acting freely, if there's nothing else you could have done, then you just don't deserve praise or blame for your actions. You're just a conduit through which the universe enacts its evolution, and you don't deserve praise or blame for it. I think this is quite a tricky one for the hard determinists to deal with. What they usually say is they just kind of swallow hard and say, all right, moral responsibility is an illusion too. That's quite a hard thing to accept. Would the hard determinists say that we ought to, I don't know, throw open the prison doors and let all the captives free, so to speak? We should let all the prisoners out because they don't deserve it? Well, not exactly. So I think the hard determinists do have to say that they don't deserve it. It's hard to deny that. If you're a hard determinist, it's very hard to find room for praise or blame or desert. But they can appeal to other non-desert, say, having to do with what people deserve, non-desert based justifications for punishment. They can say, well, we have to lock people in prison for security, right? If you've got a burglar, the burglar's going to go around burglarizing houses. We lock them away, then they can't burglarize any houses. So, that's good. Even if they don't deserve it, you take them out of society and society is better off as a result. Or you might say, look, locking people up will deter others. Suppose you're thinking about going into a career of burglary, but you discover that burglars get thrown in prison, which is very unpleasant, and it'll deter you from burglarizing. In England, they actually say burglary. So a deterrence, that's one justification. Or sometimes people appeal to rehabilitation. So the idea here is that by locking somebody up, that person is going to reflect on the error of their ways. They're going to come out a different person, less prone to burglarizing, and we're all better off as a result. And finally, you might appeal just to satisfaction of victims' grievances. So when some crime happens, victims are often very upset, naturally. And when somebody gets thrown in prison, there's some sense of closure or some sense of satisfaction that the perpetrator of the crime against them has been caught and punished. And indeed, it's not just the victims' grievances that we can appeal to here. Often, if it's a very public crime, lots of people in society feel, that someone should be locked up, and they're not happy until they get locked up, even if those people are not involved in the crime at all. So, if it's a very famous crime, people have strong opinions about whether people should be locked up or not, even though they weren't affected directly. So, the question was, does a hard determinist have to open the prison doors and let everybody out because they don't deserve it? Response, no. There are at least these 4 other reasons you can give for locking people up. But, is that sufficient? Is it really a position that you find appealing? That we can justify locking people up for security or deterrence or rehabilitation or satisfaction reasons, even though they don't deserve it? I think most of us are inclined to say, well, if they don't deserve it, even if it has these benefits, we shouldn't be locking people up. So it's not clear that the hard determinist has a really good response to these worries about moral responsibility. Okay, so a couple of remarks and a summary of hard determinism here. So this is really a metaphysical problem. We're trying to understand the nature of free will. But notice this is one of these cases, there aren't many of these cases, where a metaphysical problem kind of surfaces in political discussions. In this case, political discussions of crime and punishment. It strikes me that people on the political left often emphasize that people are products of their background somehow. So this is a kind of hard determinist. And they think that this should mean that we should be less inclined to lock them up. People on the political right emphasize that people should take responsibility for their actions. They emphasize personal responsibility rather than society's role of the person's upbringing or background or something like that. It's not obvious to me why we should split left and right in the way that they do, but they do. And you can see that the question isn't really a political question at all. It's a deep metaphysical issue. It's politically neutral in and of itself. It's an interesting remark. It's not often that philosophy has bearing on political questions of the day. The second remark, I focused on moral responsibility here, but really moral responsibility is just a representative of the whole class of attitudes, and hard determinists have to reject them all. So, because if everything's fixed and determined, they have to say, well, look, you don't deserve praise or blame, but also there's no grounds for being indignant today. If your roommate steals your shoes one night and gets them all muddy, you're indignant and annoyed at her for doing this. Well, if you're a hard determinist, indignation is out of place because everything was fixed at the moment of the Big Bang. It's not as if your roommate could have avoided doing it. It was built into the stars, so to speak. It's bound to happen. Same goes for esteem or courage or cowardice. We take all these attitudes towards people. We hold some in esteem, we regard some as courageous, we denounce some as cowardly. But if hard determinism is true, all of these attitudes are misplaced, right? People just can't avoid doing what they do. So it's just inappropriate to react with indignation or hold people in esteem. Any attitude that we take towards people but wouldn't take towards sticks and stones seems to be out of place. In particular, it's hard to make sense of agency. So there are various projects and commitments, you have goals in life and so on, and they kind of give your life meaning. You're devoted to some cause or something like that. But if hard determinism is true, none of it is really yours. The thoughts that you have, the things that you commit yourself to, the projects you engage in and so on, they're really, you're just a conduit through which the universe plants these things in you. So it seems to undermine agents. So really, perhaps that's the deep cost of rejecting free will. It undermines our idea of what a person is, at least if we think of people as agents of some kind. So is there any alternative to hard determinism? I thought we'd look just briefly at one alternative here, just for a few minutes. So here's the summary then. So hard determinists say, no one ever acts freely. They don't deny that we feel we're acting free. They don't deny that we do exactly what we choose to do sometimes, at least if that choice means decision. It just denies that those show we're acting freely. It does deny, however, that we're morally responsible for our actions, and it denies all those other attitudes that are essential to understanding various entities in the universe as genuine persons. Most people react by saying, that's too much to give up. That's unacceptable. We just can't give up on acting freely if it means giving up on moral responsibility and all those other attitudes. So better to reject one of the other principles. So let's have a look just the last few minutes at rejecting the first principle instead. Every event has a cause. So perhaps we should just say, well, perhaps there are some events that are uncaused, right? That view is known as indeterminism. It rejects the idea of universal causation. We can allow that lots of events have causes, but just some don't. They think that some events are literally uncaused, and they accept the other principles, including the principle of how free. And they also hold that people are morally responsible for their actions. That's really part of the motivation. Rejecting hard determinism is appealing to people because they want to make room for moral responsibility, and hard determinists don't seem to be able to do so. So what is the indeterminist analysis of acting freely? Well, here's a simple analysis. Acting freely means doing some action that's uncaused, right? That's to say, there were no set of prior conditions that necessitated its occurrence. There might be lots of things that incline you to do one thing rather than another, but none of them force you to. That's the problem with hard determinism. It says that the prior events make your actions inevitable, something. And the indeterminist says, no, even if there are various factors that incline you one way rather than another, you can always just not do it, right? Some events are uncaused. The problem is that has its difficulties too. So let me raise an objection here to indeterminism. Here's a little scenario. I'll call it the bodyguard and the great leader. So the scenario is this. There's this great leader, right? And let's suppose the bodyguard goes to bodyguard school and gets his dream job of becoming a bodyguard for the great leader. And he's standing there one day waiting for the great leader to get out of his car or something like this, or I don't know, come to the hall or something. He's got his gun out just in case, and his finger squeezes the trigger. That's the first event, E1. E2, the gun fires. You know where this is going, right? E3, the great leader is shot. Event 4, the great leader dies. So we've got a sequence of events. E1 causes E2, which causes E3, which causes E4. But here's the hard determinist will accept all this. Here's the indeterminist part. Nothing causes E1. The indeterminist says there are events that are uncaused. So let's suppose that E1 is one of them, right? They say there are such events. Let's let E1 be one of them. So let's suppose that nothing causes E1. Now, here's the objection to indeterminism. If it were true, then the bodyguard would be morally responsible for killing the great leader. Why? Indeterminism says that we're morally responsible for the consequences of our free actions. We go back. E1 is a free action because it's uncaused, and that's our definition of a free action. And one of the consequences of that is E4. So if indeterminism is true, then the bodyguard is morally responsible for killing the great leader because it was a free action that led to his death. E1 led to his death after all, and the free action was simply uncaused. It wasn't caused by the bodyguard thinking something. It wasn't caused by the bodyguard wanting the great leader dead. It wasn't caused by an electrical signal from his brain causing his muscles to contract. It was literally uncaused. And the claim then is that the bodyguard is not morally responsible for killing the great leader because no one's responsible for events that they didn't cause. And this is an event that really nothing caused. It involved his finger, but that's just an accident, right? Could have involved anything. So the bodyguard is not morally responsible for killing the great leader, and so indeterminism is not true. So you can see that there's a problem here. You might say, well, this is a crazy scenario. Fingers don't just squeeze for no reason. All right. Perhaps you think that indeterminism is a non-starter because it posits the existence of uncaused events and perhaps you just can't bring yourself to believe in uncaused events. But the objection here is something like this. Even if there are uncaused events, even if we accept the kind of metaphysical picture that indeterminism offers, it fails in its own terms because it still doesn't make room for moral responsibility, even if there are uncaused events. There's a response you might give. So as an indeterminist, you might say, well, look, that was a useless analysis of what it is to acting freely, because, you know, an uncaused event in your finger. This is a better analysis. To say someone acted freely in doing some action is to say that the action was caused by an uncaused decision, not by something in your finger, but by a decision. And the decision itself now. So nothing made you decide what to do when you make decisions. There might be, things that incline you one way or another, but you make the decision and you weren't forced to do so. And so that gets around the objection. The bodyguard's finger squeezing wasn't caused by a decision, it was not caused by anything. So now the indeterminist escapes the objection. Unfortunately, it doesn't escape for long. So consider this new sequence of events. It's the same as the old one, but now we have a new event. The bodyguard decides to squeeze the trigger, right? So let's suppose that for some reason the bodyguard decided to squeeze the trigger, but this new event was uncaused. So now we have this extra sort of element in our picture, but it's uncaused. So and the bodyguard, the second version of the bodyguard story has to say, in effect, that the bodyguard is in this new scenario. Sorry, let me just skip through these. Sorry, I wasn't going to skip through these. So in this new scenario, we've got the same problem back again. So the worry was that the objection to indeterminism puts the free action at the level of a finger. It's literally uncaused. How can you be responsible for it if it's uncaused? All right, fair enough. Let's make it a decision. Say, oh, that's better. But if it's uncaused, that's still the same problem. How can you be responsible for the results of events that are literally uncaused? They're not caused by you. They're not caused by anything. It doesn't matter whether they're in the finger or the brain or anywhere else. If they're uncaused, it's hard to see how you can be morally responsible. The indeterminist says we are morally responsible for their consequences. That's false. Intuitively, we're not. So indeterminism is false. And it doesn't matter where you. So that's the idea. So let me just make a couple of final remarks here. The motivation for the indeterminist rejection of holding that every event has a cause is to make room for moral responsibility. But the bodyguard cases show that it fails to do that. It just chucks in a few random events into the picture. And how can that be an explanation? How can that relieve you? How can that be what you're morally responsible for? Stepping back from our particular problem, some people think that the quantum mechanics offers a way to understand what freedom's all about, because people say, and quantum mechanics is indeterministic, it involves random events, but so does indeterminism. Throwing in a few random events is not really going to make room for moral responsibility. You're no more responsible for random events than you are for caused ones. So I think it reveals quite how acute the problem is. As we saw with hard determinism, if every event has a cause, it's hard to see how moral responsibility fits in. But even if some events are uncaused in our indeterminist picture, it's hard to see where moral responsibility fits in. Randomness doesn't give you responsibility. So either way, it's hard to see what we do. So really final remark. So perhaps what this puzzle shows is that we can't make sense of what it is to be a person in the most basic possible sense as a rational agent. Agency requires free will, rationality requires universal causation, and we can't seem to have it both ways. But free will is something that we take with deep seriousness. It crops up when we talk about evil in theological discussions, for instance, and it illustrates a more general philosophical issue. So often philosophers are engaged in a project of reconciling what's sometimes called the scientific image and the manifest image. The manifest means everyday image. So, if you look at what science says and what current physics says, it's very crudely The world consists of a bunch of tiny little fundamental particles whizzing about in the void. But that's the picture you get from science. The everyday picture is not of little particles whizzing about in the void. It's of tables and chairs and trees and galaxies and all the rest of it. They're both theories of the whole world, an everyday theory and a scientific theory. So, and we think they're both true, right? So we want to show how they kind of mesh. The trouble is they don't mesh very well. So the scientific image is a sea of isolated microscopic particles. The manifest image is this everyday world, but some things stand in the way of meshing. Free will is one of them. There doesn't seem to be anything remotely resembling free will at the level of microscopic particles, and yet there is in the manifest image. So it's hard, gets in the way of kind of making them mesh. Another one, in case you're interested, that we could have talked about is consciousness. We can't deny we're conscious, but they can't argue that it's incoherent to deny that we're conscious, because to deny anything, we have to be conscious. But that doesn't seem to be something that we can reconcile with the scientific image either. So we've got these. So free will is a representative puzzle in a whole class of sort of interesting philosophical puzzles. Right, there we go. Sorry, that took longer than I thought I would, but you know, I always do. So I apologize for that. But any questions that people have here? If you could just let's see. So how are we going to do this? Let me stop sharing, perhaps.
So if you want to stop sharing, that was wonderful. Thank you. Feel free, everyone in our webinar, feel free to put questions in the chat about any of that, and we will try to get to it.
No. Sure. Oh, stop share. There we go. There we go.
All right, you've got a couple in the chat if you can see.
Okay, so let's have a look. So actually in the chat I just see the Q&A.
Yeah, Q&A.
Sorry. Okay, so Nathan says, if every event has a cause and decisions determined by preceding events, does it make sense to hold people accountable for their actions, or is accountability itself an illusion? I guess you posted that. So that's I mean, I think that's the heart of the problem, really. We've got all these kind of attitudes that we take towards people that we don't take towards sticks and stones and things like that. But it's very hard to understand free will in a way that allows us to do this. Determinists can't seem to fit it in. Indeterminists can't seem to fit it in. There are a couple of other theories that we haven't looked at. One that rejects the third principle, one that rejects the fourth principle. We don't have time to go over them, but I'll just remark that there are problems with those too. Very hard to fit moral responsibility in anyway. So now let's see, what else do we have here? What's the origin of the? Oh, so am I a determinist? So, students often ask, so I present various theories in my classes, and students often ask, well, what one do you believe in? And so here's what I say, here's my standard response to that. Everybody has various prejudices and biases. So when they're presenting theories, the ones that they really believe in, they might give more, they'll present them more carefully, and the ones that they don't think are very good, they might be more, not present them as well. So it's good for the students to know what the professor thinks, to make adjustments. So you can, he believes that, so he's sort of trying to make out he's really good, and he doesn't believe this way. So that's a reason for telling the students the answer, what I believe. On the other hand, if you tell students what to do, there are 4 rival theories, and you want to write a paper on one of them, if you tell them which one you think, they'll write on that, and they'll say that they think that that's right, far too often. So you want students to think independently. So there's there's pluses and minuses both sides. My own judgment is that telling you is worse. So I tend not to say. So I agree that has its minuses, and but that's what I think is best. So I don't say. So sorry, I'm going to decline to answer that. The origin of the fourth axiom, and why is it the foundation of this discussion? So it's supposed to come from the notion of a cause, and it's supposed to really just come from the ordinary, everyday notion of a cause that we employ, in science and employ in everyday life. It says only that causes precede their effects and make their effects happen, which seems quite minimal. But it is a puzzle. The free will puzzle, free will and determinism, is really a puzzle about both free will and causation, and trying to make sense of both. So that's why it gets to be foundation. Does it contrast with absurdism? So it kind of depends on what you mean by absurdism, but certainly, if you're thinking of the existentialists, which are a school of philosophy that flourished, particularly in France after World War II, but it had its roots in kind of early 20th century philosophy in Heidegger, and in perhaps 19th century philosophical thinking too, with Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. So if you're thinking about that, then it is one of the motivations for it in some ways, I think. I mean, they were often more worried about, what to do in a world that lacked God, and, how you should behave morally, given the lack of a kind of a theological basis for morality, or what kind of political positions we should adopt given that situation. So they were focused more on the ethics of it than the metaphysics. But it certainly was a motivation. Yes, Calvinists also were determinists, right? Some Calvinists. So that's a very interesting question. I wish I had more to say about that. More time to talk about that, because that's a very interesting one. Yeah, so here's another interesting one too. Is it a valid argument that if believing in free will allows society to function, we should believe in it? Well, I guess so. If you want society to function, is it required, a belief in free will, to let society function? That's a very tricky question. It's partly a sociological question. But certainly our kind of justice system and everything else does seem to presuppose it. So it does seem to be required. Would society cease to function if this belief generally dropped out? I don't know. I'm not sure about it. There's a lot more to say there too. So, if you come to Tufts, which obviously you should, because it's just a fantastic school, then you can roll in one of my classes or a philosophy class, and we can discuss these more. Let's see what this. I'm happy to just answer all of these, I think. But feel free to go now we've hit the 7 o'clock mark. If determinism is true, and we aren't metaphysically responsible for action, morally responsible, is it logical for us to be morally responsible for ourselves, since we still comprehend right and wrong? So it's probably hard to, it's probably hard to kind of really believe in a theory that says no one's ever responsible for their action. You can say it, but it's really hard to, if you saw someone just setting fire to cats for no good reason, you think, well, that's a terrible thing to do, right? And you think that the person should be stopped or punished or something like that. Even if you claim to be a hard determinist, it's very hard to really believe it in this sense. So is it logical? I'm not sure. Maybe you think one of the other theories that makes room for free will is good enough. But it's certainly a very hard position to believe as a matter of psychology, I think. Is it possible for someone to be a wholly irrational agent? I think if you are wholly irrational, you barely count as an agent. So an agent is someone who does things for reasons. So if your actions were completely random, if there was someone just behind a pillar controlling with some kind of Bluetooth device, controlling everything you did, then your actions wouldn't be based on reason, they'd be irrational. Or if you're so utterly crazy, I know that's not the standard term now, but I can't remember what it is. So you are so utterly deranged that you count as fully rational. I don't think we'd regard you as an agent. I mean, we don't tend to regard people as morally responsible for their actions if they're completely delusional or something like that, or hallucinating. So it's hard to. So perhaps irrational agent is a kind of oxymoron in a sense. How might sorry, where am I now? rationality. Possible for. Do you think the positive connotation of the word free inclines students to reject hardcore? Yes, I think thinking this makes it hard. Positive connotations, but you know, a lot of these connotations are, you know, they're sort of political in nature, and so you know, the metaphysical question doesn't really come into it so much. I think the positive connotations arise at a higher level, so to speak. It's just, you know, psychological speculation isn't really my strong point. Would moral responsibility be the cause of survival of the fittest? Having hypothetically having a certain moral code in the society would potentially even take beneficial actions towards their own success and survival as a society. Couldn't the questions of moral responsibility be chalked up to questions of natural selection? There's a big literature on this, and it's very hard to give a short answer that would be worthwhile, because there's just so much written on this. Where to start? So clearly, you know, everything we do in a sense is the result of evolution, right? We've evolved. So certainly, you know, there's that. But and that covers our kind of moral views as well. It covers our mathematical views as well. I mean, we've evolved to be able to think mathematically, and we've evolved to think morally. Is that strongly connected with personal success or survival as a society? That's a disputed matter. I think people have a tendency to assume that ethics is the reason we have ethics is because it benefits society or something like that. But I think you'll find, and perhaps this is surprising, that most philosophers don't think that. If you ask them what's ethics for, they'll say it's not for anything. It's just discovering the truth about things. It's just like mathematics or botany or something like that. What's botany for? It's not for anything. It's just discovering the truth about plants. Mathematics, it's just, you hope it'll be useful in various ways, but it's not really for anything. And I think most philosophers think the same about ethics, right? It's not really for anything. Perhaps it's, if we're an ethical society, we're more likely to be a society that's longer lived and more robust or something, and might be better and more capable of surviving, but perhaps not. It's hard to say, but I don't think philosophers think that that's really what ethical questions boil down to. Okay, so how are we doing? Example you had, E0 causes the next and so on. So realistically, does nothing cause the first thought or action? Okay, good. So I mentioned the Big Bang, but of course, I was pretending it was the first cause. But of course, if the principle says that every event has a cause, so does the Big Bang, right? So there can be no first cause at all if every event has a cause, because events come earlier. So I kind of ignored that issue. It does come up a lot. It comes up, it doesn't really come up in questions of free will because, you know, if we're worried about free will, we only need to worry about free will in human beings. And human beings have only been around for a few 100,000 years. So as long as every event for the last few 100,000 years has a cause, we've got our problem with free will. We don't need to worry about whether the Big Bang had a cause or not, really. But of course, people do worry about this because they're worried about understanding causation more generally, which is part of our problem. And so there's a lot of discussion, theological discussion. There are various arguments for the existence of God that take their starting point from the idea that there must have been a first cause, right? That we can't just have a series of causes going back indefinitely into the past. There must have been a beginning, otherwise we'd never got to here because you have to have many events before we get anywhere. There must have been a beginning, and only God could be the beginning, that kind of thing. So they use this as an argument for the existence of God. So there's a lot of interesting stuff here. To what extent would you say existentialism and determinism disagree? So I think existentialism presupposes that we have free will. Does that mean rejecting determinism? It means rejecting hard determinism. There are other forms of materialism. I mentioned soft determinism. It's sometimes called compatibilism. that holds both, that holds that everything's determined and we act freely. So sorry we didn't have time to look at that theory, but an existentialist would be happy to accept that. Well, not necessarily, but they could accept that. They could accept determinism as long as it's a soft form of determinism, not the hard form. Is a valid objection to hard determinists to say that you can be defined as all the electrochemical forces in your brain, and therefore you have free will, even if it's these forces that are truly making the decision. Again, it's a shame we don't have time to talk about soft determinism, because that's really the soft determinism's home turf. That's what they really want to combine. They want to combine acting freely with the idea that everything is just, purely physical, electrochemical, something like that. So they want to hold that view and hold the free will view. So I think they'd answer your question. You have free will even if these forces are truly making the decision. Well, I'd say yes, but they wouldn't say that means that you're not truly making, but you are those forces. So you are truly making. Anyway, good. So, do we have any more over here? Theological influence that free will have on people. Calvinism. I think I mentioned some of those things, but you're absolutely right. There's a lot of interesting stuff here. Also interesting is the debate among Islamic scholars about the existence of free will or destiny. Yes, that's right. So these questions are very general ones, and they arise in all sorts of cultures all over the world. So they have a different, they're manifested slightly differently in the way people discuss them, but in essence, this metaphysical problem is the same across the discussions in different cultures and different religions. Right. And I'm glad, Lucy, finally, I'm glad your mum let you borrow her computer.
All right. Did we get through everything? Are we good on questions, I think? Okay. I think so. Great. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in and listening. Really appreciate it. If you want to do more events like this, if this was really fun for you, we have a bunch of Fall for Tufts more. We have more mock classes, we have panels, all sorts of fun things to help you kind of learn more about Tufts as you're, navigating your fall, potentially doing college applications or starting to think about your future wherever you're at in that process. So yeah, feel free. I'm going to put a link in the chat if you are not familiar with this link for more Fall for Tufts events already. Feel free to check that out. But I'm going to stop our recording, and I hope everyone has a good night. So thank you all.
Yeah, thanks very much. Sorry to go over time, but